And in the interest of being seen, I'm going to grab the handheld. Otherwise, it'll be like a Kilroy kind of an experience here. Are we on? We're on. Great. Well, I want to thank again Greenbuilder Media for, bringing such an incredible group together, and it's a real privilege to be sharing the stage with so many extraordinary speakers, but I really do want to dive right in with a little bit about my background that was mentioned already. I've sat across the table from many governors and mayors and county and tribal leaders and community leaders that are aware of these opportunities to innovate and have even the political will in their jurisdiction and want to be taking on stronger codes and standards and advancing sustainability and resilience in their community, but they keep bumping up against what they perceive to be the challenge, which is how are we going to pay for it? Now, ultimately, we know that this stuff will pay for itself. And I'm going to dive into some of the specific ways that modernization, use of strong codes and standards, and sustainability, and strengthening the built environment will ultimately pay for itself. But there is that front-end investment. Whether we're rebuilding stronger after a disaster, building stronger on the front end, or retrofitting on a sunny day to try to prevent loss. So let's talk about how we can come up with some of that financing on the front end, because it's not going to be free. But we have to remember that what we're comparing that investment against are extraordinary public and private costs when disasters do strike and when systems do fail. We need look no farther than, we've run out of superlatives of how to describe the wildfire season of last year, droughts that have been threatening the water supply and the food security of the United States and the world, as well as the impacts on recreation and tourism and on the built environment. One of the greater costs to my industry now, which is insurance and reinsurance, is in the form of these slow drips that cause substantial water damage, but also expansive soils and the ways that the extremes of the hydrometeorological cycle are hitting the built environment, whether it's a home or a skyscraper or a water treatment plant. The costs are significant. And yet the science is there. And if there is a key takeaway for you all to have with you this afternoon from my talk, it is that the science and the data and the analytics are available to help us understand and actually quantify and monetize risk, to feed that into models and standards, but also to feed it into the design of solutions in the built environment and the design of solutions in finance. We're comparing that also, though, with the costs of extraordinary impacts from this year's storm season, from 2017, rather. NOAA released today estimates of more than $300 billion in loss just in the United States from the disasters that were declared of 2017. That's on top of $350 billion in loss that were paid out through the federal government to recover from disasters just in the last decade, not counting 2017. So we can either continue the old outmoded way of rebuilding after disasters, or we can get out ahead of these impacts. We know from studies from the National Institute for Building Science that for every dollar we invest in resilience, we can get a $4 return on that investment, and that's using data from before 2005. The National Institute for Building Science is going to be updating that study. They are anticipating putting out some preliminary numbers later this month, and we could be seeing returns of that investment of more like $7 or $8 or more. So as we try to get more data built into the way that we measure impacts, then we can go about investing the billions, the tens of billions that we're going to be spending in Houston, in Puerto Rico, and the US Virgin Islands, in Florida, and in California to address last year's disasters, but rebuilding to be stronger and rebuilding to better address the risks that we know are going to be coming. The real opportunities are at the sweet spot, at the intersection of sustainability and resilience. So not only can we be rebuilding Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands and BVI to be stronger, but to also be more energy efficient. There are examples that we could be looking to that are present, for example, in Bermuda, where they are, much like other of the Caribbean islands, unable to evacuate. So every home and building in Bermuda has a cistern underneath it. And that enables people to weather in place so they can be surviving over the long term. Even if they don't have access to clean water, they can access that through their cistern. But today, we know that the suffering in Puerto Rico is continuing. So where we've already seen approval of more than $50 billion of supplemental appropriations to rebuild from last year's storms, we need to be getting that down to Puerto Rico, to Houston, to here in Florida, and out west to California to address the humanitarian disaster as well. We also see the impacts when people are not able to get access to clean and potable water supplies. So not only do they not have access to stable power, but they also end up with the public health emergencies of not being able to access clean water. And in Houston, where the main impacts were to the housing industry, far too much of the impacts in Houston were to housing that had been built after the most modern flood insurance rate maps were produced. So where we see a lot of impact to housing, this is modern housing stock that should have been taking those flood risks into account, but did not. Now, after Harvey, we see Houston, for the first time, adopting flood resilience standards that are actually among some of the strongest in the nation. So where we're sending billions down to Texas to rebuild the Texas Gulf Coast, for the city of Houston at least, that rebuilding will need to be 2 feet or more above the elevation of the 500-year flood. So this is a way of investing in resilience so that those folks will be higher and drier in the next big storm. This matters to cities for all sorts of reasons. Folks may be aware that Moody's, the large municipal credit rating agency, has been looking at issues of sustainability and resilience for really the better part of 10 to 15 years. After Katrina and the credit downgrades in New Orleans, Moody's and S&P really started taking a look at this. And they would come in and talk to us in the White House in the previous administration and try to figure out how they could actually measure the performance of a city in a way that would be just and equitable. Is it really fair to look at Orlando, for example, and say, how resilient are you really as compared to New York or Houston or Tulsa? What we really need to be doing is comparing Orlando today with what a resilient Orlando can be. And in this way, it kind of came down to my kingdom for a metric. And it was only in the last 6 to 8 months that Moody's landed on a set of 6 indicators that they're going to be using to measure the resilience of communities. One of those indicators is the number of structures, the built environment, that they have in this so-called 100-year floodplain. They're also going to be looking at the ways that communities are positioning themselves to be ready for the atmospheric and hydrologic and meteorologic changes that are coming. So where cities like Orlando are getting out ahead of the curve, you're going to fare very well under Moody's credit rating as compared to other cities that I won't name, that have chosen to essentially permit right up to the water's edge, not adopt the strong standards that are available, and basically roll the dice with everybody else's money. So this is something that the credit rating agencies are actively paying attention to, and one can expect as science feeds into the metrics of sustainability and resilience, you'll be able to differentiate between communities that are getting out ahead of these issues and those that simply are not. There are costs that are associated with those investments, though. So let's get into how we address some of that. How many folks in this room are concerned about the cost of flood insurance? There are a few of you out there. Keep your hand up if you would, please, if you currently have flood insurance. Outstanding. Now, please keep your hand up if you have flood insurance, but you're outside the mapped floodplain. That is to say, you have flood insurance that you're not legally required to have. Okay, you guys are my heroes. What you've done is something that sadly, hundreds of thousands of people in Harris County and Houston did not do. 80% of the losses in Hurricane Harvey were uninsured. 80% of the losses in the Texas Gulf Coast were uninsured. What that means is the $60 billion disaster aid package that the Texas governor requested of all of us is to rebuild from folks that were flooded but did not have flood insurance. Now, if they have a federally backed loan and they are in the floodplain, they're required by law to have flood insurance. But unfortunately, the enforcement mechanisms are not as strong as they could be. Ultimately, we've ended up with a national flood insurance program that is $30 billion in debt to the federal treasury with no hope of ever being able to repay that debt. Not at premiums that anybody in this room is willing to pay, right? So what we see are two opportunities that we can be bringing down the cost of flood insurance. Okay, well, really three. One way is to just subsidize it. And that's completely unsustainable. This is how the program has ended up in debt. The other way to do it, though, is to increase market size. And so that means every single one of you all that kept your hand up because you have a flood insurance policy that you are not required by law to have, that is actually broadening the market for flood insurance and helping to drive down the cost of that insurance, not only for you, but for everyone else. It's the same theory that we see with the Affordable Care Act and needing more healthy people to come into the market. You guys are the equivalent of the healthy people coming into the market to help drive down and manage those costs. But the other ways that we can reduce the cost of insurance is to actually reduce the risk, to drive down the hydrograph in these communities so that the waters don't reach the elevation or the velocities that they reach that do so much of the damage. So what are some of the ways that we can actually mitigate risk? When it comes to flood, it's pretty intuitive. It's gravity, basically build higher, right? Or be farther from the water source and the flood source so that you're less susceptible to flood. Or if you do get wet, the depths don't get as high, the velocities don't get as high, you don't end up with those lateral loads that can tear a home off its foundation. In most homes, once flood elevation gets about 2.5 feet up, or once it reaches the level of the electrical sockets, you're a lot more likely to end up with a home that's what's called substantially damaged. It's going to have to be rebuilt to meet modern code. So if we can lower that and make some of these flood events closer to the carpet soakers that we'd rather that they be, rather than deep, devastating floods, that is an important way to not only lower insurance costs, but actually lower risk. Other ways to do it that help us get to wind resilience have been developed through the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety. I'm not going to subject you to a video here because we weren't sure that it would run and we really want to honor y'all's time. But what you see here is a recent study that they did comparing a home that was built to standard modern building code there on the left to one that was built to a standard called fortified. They subjected that to hurricane force winds, and what we see is one mode of failure, where the home is actually being removed from its foundation because of the lateral loads of the wind and the structure not being properly tied down to withstand those forces. Some of the other failure modes are when the roof completely blows off. Then you end up with severe damage inside the home, not only from rain, but also from wind. So the Insurance Institute for Business and Home Safety has been advancing the opportunities through the fortified standard to reduce the cost of damage. But how do we pay for the front end investment? On a new construction of a brand new roof or a rebuilt roof, it could be in the hundreds of dollars. But to retrofit, it could be a little bit more than that. So one of the ways that we've been going about the finance is to actually capture future reductions in insurance cost and disaster loss to invest that in front-end investments in resilience. We can also do this through NOAA tide gauge and other networks. We're studying this for many coastal communities so that we can develop products called resilience bonds, where we can be capturing the future savings and reduced disaster loss. And in the event that the disaster strikes, the bond simply pays and the loan can be repaid. So there are multiple models and ways of going about this, and we'd be happy to talk further offline in the Q&A session. I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you all very much.